John chapter 6, verses 22 through 40. You'll remember as you're turning there that in chapter 6, Jesus has shown the crowd the great miracle of feeding the 5,000 and then walking on water. And now the crowd catches up to him and Jesus gives the famous I am the bread of life sermon. And we'll look at that this morning, the first part of the I am the bread of life sermon of Jesus Christ. John chapter 6, we're going to read verses 22 through 40. The day following, the people which stood on the other side of the sea saw that there was none other ship there, save that one whereinto his disciples were entered. And that Jesus went not with his disciples in the ship, but that his disciples were gone alone. And that there came other ships from Tiberias near unto the place where they ate the bread, after the Lord had given thanks. Now when the people saw that Jesus was not there, neither his disciples, they also took shipping and came to Capernaum seeking for Jesus. And when they had found him on the other side of the sea, they said unto him, Rabbi, when camest thou hither? Jesus answered them and said, Verily, verily, I say unto you, ye seek me not because ye saw the miracles, but because ye ate of the loaves and were filled. Labor not for the meat which perisheth, but for the meat that endureth unto everlasting life, which the Son of Man shall give unto you, for him hath God the Father sealed. Then said they unto him, What shall we do that we might work the works of God? Jesus answered and said unto them, This is the work of God, that ye believe in him whom he hath sent. They said therefore unto him, What sign showest thou then, that we may see it, and believe thee? What dost thou work? Our fathers did eat manna in the desert, as it is written, He gave them bread from heaven to eat. Then Jesus said unto them, Verily, verily, I say unto you, Moses gave you not that bread from heaven, but my Father giveth you that bread from heaven. For the bread of God is he which cometh down from heaven and giveth life unto the world. Then they said unto him, Lord, evermore give us this bread. And Jesus said unto them, I am that bread of life. He that cometh to me shall not hunger, and he that believeth in me shall never thirst. But I said unto you that ye also have seen me, and believe not. All that the Father giveth me shall come to me, and him that cometh to me I cast not away. For I came down from heaven not to do mine own will, but his will which has sent me. And this is the Father's will which has sent me, that of all which he hath given me I should lose nothing, but should raise it up again at the last day. And this is the will of him that sent me, that every man which seeth the Son and believeth in him should have everlasting life, and I will raise him up at the last day. Title of our message this morning, Jesus' I am the bread of life sermon, part 1. Our introduction. In the 6th chapter of John, the writer has recorded 2 miracles. You may follow in your bulletin if you'd like, or you can listen either way. He's recorded 2 miracles, the feeding of the 5,000 and the walking on the water. Both miracles were performed in the city of Bethsaida. After Jesus departs Bethsaida by walking across the water, he is followed to Capernaum by the crowd who desire to see another miracle. Jesus refuses to give them more miracles, but he will explain to them the sign of the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000. There are 4 points to our message. Verses 22 to 24, the crowd searches for Jesus. Verses 25 to 29, the crowd misunderstands the, quote, work of faith. What exactly is the work of faith? Verses 30 through 34, the crowd, again, misunderstands Jesus as the true bread of life. And then in verses 35 to 40, Jesus explains, without allegory, his mysterious riddle. Here's the context. Since the crowd was slow to understand the sign of Jesus' miracle of feeding the 5,000, because it was meant to be a sign, not just a miracle, Jesus attempts to explain his sign by allegory. When this also fails, we'll see, Jesus tells them plainly, that he is the bread of life. Not merely the kind of bread that provides physical nourishment, but a greater bread, sent by the Father to give eternal life to God's elect. We look at our first verses, verses 22 to 24. The crowd searches for Jesus. Verse 22. The day following, the people which stood on the other side of the sea saw that there was no other ship there, save that one, whereinto his disciples were entered, and that Jesus went not with his disciples in the ship, but that his disciples were gone alone. A little confusing. Jesus and his disciples, as we know from last week's text, had miraculously landed on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee in the city of Capernaum, sometime between 3 and 6 in the morning. It's now the next day, the morning after the feeding of the 5,000, and Jesus is walking on the water. A large part of the same crowd that Jesus had dismissed in Bethsaida had not gone home, but had remained overnight on that eastern shore where they had experienced the feeding of the 5,000. Now, as morning approaches, the crowd began to realize that there had been only one boat on the shore. They knew that the disciples had boarded that boat, and that Jesus did not board that boat, but rather had gone up to a mountain to pray. The crowd then began to search for Jesus, assuming he was still there, thinking he must still be in Bethsaida. Soon they discovered that Jesus was no longer in Bethsaida. Now they know that Jesus did not get on the boat with his disciples, and it is not possible that he could walk by land across the marsh to Capernaum, for someone would have seen him leave the mountain, because they were watching him intently. It had never occurred to the people that Jesus might have just walked across the Sea of Galilee, but that's what he had done. Verses 23 and 24. And that there came other ships from Tiberias near unto the place where they ate the bread, after the Lord had given thanks. Now when the people saw that Jesus was not there, neither his disciples, they also took shipping and came to Capernaum seeking for Jesus. See, now the people wanted to be near to Jesus, or at least return to their homes, which were likely in Capernaum. That's the biggest city. The walk to Capernaum from Bethsaida was 10 miles through marshy grass, a very unpleasant walk. So what happened was, intelligence had reached people in the city of Tiberias that there were a whole lot of people on a shore in Bethsaida who needed transport back to their homes. So the boat owners from Tiberias saw in this a great profit, transportation. So many boats looking for business came in order to transport the people from Bethsaida back to Capernaum. Before the people boarded the boats, though, they made a thorough search for Jesus. They also made sure that the disciples hadn't returned during the night and picked up Jesus. The crowds knew that Jesus' so-called headquarters were in Capernaum. They knew that. They also knew that Capernaum was the main hub for boating. So most of the crowd thought, since they wanted to find Jesus, that it would be a good guess to try to find Jesus in Capernaum. So those 3 verses just explain how the crowd came from Bethsaida after the feeding of the 5,000 and came to Capernaum to find Jesus. Where we find in our second point, they find him. Verses 25 to 29, the crowd misunderstand the work of faith. Verse 25. And when they found him on the other side of the sea, they said unto him, Rabbi, when camest thou hither? Jesus answered them and said, Verily, verily, I say unto you, ye seek me not because ye saw the miracles, but because ye ate of the loaves and were filled. So here we learn that the crowd has traveled to Capernaum, and they do find Jesus there. It is grace on Jesus' part that he even allows himself to be found, by the way. And he continues to teach them. The miracle should have been enough. The people wish to know how Jesus even came to be in Capernaum, secretly hoping that Jesus is going to tell them about another miracle. Jesus could have told them that he walked across the water. But he knew their only interest was in the miraculous nature of the miracles and not in the meaning behind the miracles. So instead, Jesus doesn't tell them how he got there, but he does give them a sharp rebuke. He says this. Jesus says that their motives for searching for him were all wrong. Jesus tells them that their only motive for searching for him was because they liked to watch the miracles but refused to believe that the miracles were authentication that he was the Messiah. They had failed to understand that the miracles were signs which pointed to Jesus as the spiritual Messiah, as the Son of God. Jesus says that they were only interested in him because he had recently filled their bellies with food. And this is very interesting. This is lost in the Greek. Jesus' verb for eating is the same word used for how animals eat. It's an insulting word. It's as if Jesus said the food was just fodder for your bellies. Jesus uses the word to rebuke them, almost calling them dumb animals, because they ate mindlessly without understanding the sign behind the miracle, just like an animal eats mindlessly just for food. That's actually what he said to them. Verse 27, Jesus tries to correct their thinking. He says this, "Labor not for the meat which perisheth, but for the meat that endureth unto everlasting life, which the Son of Man shall give unto you, for him hath God the Father sealed." Now, once again, as we learn from the book of John, Jesus offers another one of his famous riddles. In this riddle, Jesus says that there are two kinds of eating. He means to show that there is a physical eating of food, and that there is a spiritual eating that we must do. Jesus says that they should stop working for the lesser food that can only fill the stomach. Instead, that they should search for the greater food, which is the spiritual food that comes from God. Spiritual food has abiding value. Physical food only has temporary value. They need, Jesus is telling them, the spiritual food that is faith offered by the Son of God. It should have been obvious to the crowd by now that Jesus' miracles taught a deeper theological lesson. The people ignorantly clung to their temporal interpretation of Jesus' words and remained indifferent to the eternal food that Jesus was offering. Jesus then tells them plainly that the Father had sealed him, or put a stamp of approval upon the Son for all to see that he is the Son of God. But the crowd had ignored that sign, and now they were still denying that he was the Messiah. Verse 28 and 29. They said, Then said they unto him, What shall we do that we might work the works of God? Jesus answered and said unto them, This is the work of God, that you believe in him whom he has sent. The audience answers in such a way that it is obvious that they have no idea what Jesus means by this riddle. When the crowd heard Jesus tell them to labor for the enduring meat, that term labor is also work, for that enduring meat, they immediately assumed that Jesus was requiring some kind of salvation by works, especially those works typical of the Pharisees as a substitute for faith. So the people ask Jesus, What specific works do you want us to perform? The people think that Jesus is talking about specific meritorious works, and that if Jesus will just tell them exactly what those works are, that they will begin to perform those works immediately for their salvation. But when Jesus spoke of laboring for the enduring meat, he was talking about the labor of attaining faith. In other words, the work of receiving the gift of God. The work of receiving the gift of God. Jesus used the word labor because we are required to labor in order to understand what the Spirit is leading us to believe. Jesus had just given them a free gift of bread the day before as a sign to show that grace is a free gift. But the message had now been lost on the people. We might also notice the difference in how the crowd and Jesus used the word labor or work. Notice the crowd uses the word works in the plural. In other words, a series of good deeds. That's how they are thinking of the word works. Jesus corrects the plural use of the word works, you'll notice, with the singular word work, because it is not the works of man that save him, but the singular work of God that saves him. In other words, our believing is the work, singular work of God, not the plural works of men. Faith is the opposite of works. For faith is something that we receive from God, and our good works are what we return to God, and those can only be returned from faith. There can be no doubt that Jesus is teaching here salvation by grace and not by works, as we see in the other portions of John, and I've listed some there. I could have listed 100 of other references. Jesus is requiring the work of believing in him as a Messiah. That's the work he's requiring. We come to our third point, verses 30 through 34. The crowd, again, misunderstands Jesus as the true bread of heaven. Verse 30. They, that is the crowd, said therefore unto him, Jesus, what sign showest thou then, that we may see it and believe thee? What doest thou work? Our fathers did eat manna in the desert, as it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat. The crowd was startled when Jesus proclaimed himself to be so near to the Father. The crowd did not like the idea immediately that Jesus was demanding faith in his person for salvation. This, they thought, placed Jesus above their greatest prophet, who was Moses. They wanted to see some credentials. Who was Jesus to proclaim himself greater than Moses? They reasoned like this. If Jesus is even greater than Moses, then let him perform a sign that is greater than Moses. Now here's what they're thinking. Now Jesus had multiplied the loaves and the fishes, but Moses had rained down manna from heaven. The Jews reasoned that the miracle of Jesus must have been easier because Jesus actually started his miracle with bread and fish, and he had merely multiplied the elements. But Moses called down bread from heaven. Moses didn't start with any of the elements. Jesus had given them earthly bread, but Moses had given them heavenly bread, straight out of heaven. So if Jesus wants to prove that he is greater than Moses, let him give a sign that proves that he is greater than Moses. That's their reason. Verses 32 and 33. Then Jesus said unto them, Verily, verily, I say unto you, Moses gave you not that bread from heaven, but my Father giveth you that true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is he which cometh down from heaven and giveth light unto the world. Jesus again corrects the problem with the crowd's thinking. First of all, Moses did not create any bread at all, but he merely gave the crowd instructions regarding the manner in which the manna was to be collected in Exodus 16. The real giver of the bread to the Israelites was, of course, God the Father, not Moses. That's their first problem. Also, even if Moses is considered the giver, it remains true that Moses did not give the real bread from heaven, because the real bread from heaven is Jesus. Moses merely gave them the type, not the antitype. Remember, the type is the sign. The antitype is the fulfillment. In other words, the bread that came from heaven in Moses' day was a picture of the true bread from heaven that would come from heaven in the form of the Messiah. The manna that Moses provided was merely physical nourishment and preserved physical life, and was a sign of the greater bread. The real bread from heaven, which is Jesus, would provide spiritual life for the spiritually dead. In other words, the fact that Jesus is standing there as the bread of life is the greater sign that he is greater than Moses. The genuine bread Moses could not give. Not even God could give through Moses. The true bread would actually come down from heaven. Now think about this. After all, the manna didn't really come down all the way from heaven. It just fell from the sky. Jesus came all the way down from heaven. The genuine bread, which is Jesus, does more than nourish the life. The true bread gives true and eternal life to those who are dead and have no life. It's a much greater bread. The bread that came down to the Israelites from Moses only fed the Jews in the desert. The bread of life that came down in the form of Jesus gave life to all the past, present, and future elect of God. Verse 34, Then they, that is the crowd, said unto him, Jesus, Lord, evermore give us this bread. In spite of the fact that the Jews do not know what Christ is offering, it sounds so good that all they know is that they want it. They ask Jesus to give them an endless supply of whatever it is that he happens to be offering at the time. They make the same mistake, as you'll remember, as the woman at the well. When Jesus offered her living water, she accepted, thinking that Jesus was talking about some real water that would never make her thirst again or ever have to go to the well again. Right? Now these Jews do the same thing. They make the same mistake. They think that Jesus is talking about giving them some bread that will never make them hunger again or ever need bread again. And so we come to our final point, verses 35 through 40. 35 might be the funniest verse in the entire Bible, where Jesus explains his mysterious riddle. Verse 35, and Jesus said unto them, I am that bread of life. It's like he just explained it and explained it and explained it, and he's just tired of explaining it. So it's like, okay, I can't get to you through an allegory, so I'm just going to tell you plain. I am the bread of life. I am the bread of life. He that cometh to me shall not hunger, and he that believeth in me shall never thirst. So now Jesus explains his mysterious riddle. He says to them, I myself am the bread of life. You're not getting my allegory, so I'll just tell you, I am it. I am the one who both imparts and sustains life. In fact, Jesus is really saying that in his physical person is the embodiment of spiritual, everlasting life, since it is his actual body that will die for sin. This is why the church partakes of the bread, by the way, in the Lord's Supper, as we all know. As bread is given physically to sustain physical life, it is through faith and intimate union with Christ that a man attains to everlasting life. When Jesus says that he that cometh to me shall not hunger, and he that believeth in me shall never thirst, he's of course referring to spiritual hunger and spiritual thirst. When Jesus uses the phrase believeth in me, he's speaking of coming to him in the acknowledgement of our sins as one who can do nothing to save themselves, and who need Jesus to save them. We must turn to him as a plant turns to the sun for all its needs. The one who believes will in no way ever be, says Jesus, spiritually hungry or thirsty. Verses 36 and 37, Jesus goes on, But I say unto you, that ye also have seen me, and believe not. Verse 37, All that the Father giveth me shall come to me, and him that cometh to me I cast not away. Here in these two verses together, 36 and 37, we have the perfect blending of man's responsibility to believe and divine predestination working together. In verse 36, the emphasis is upon human responsibility to believe. Jesus, you'll notice here, is clearly placing the blame upon these unbelievers themselves as persons who are fully responsible for their actions of failing to believe. Jesus says to them, you've seen me and you believe not. Personal responsibility. People can't say I go to hell because I wasn't elect. Personal responsibility. That's why they went to hell. We might ask, if a man has responsibility for his own salvation, does this mean that man can take credit for his salvation? Absolutely not. Salvation is always by grace, and faith is ever the work of God in the heart of the sinner. John almost supposes that the reader might make the error of taking credit for God's gift of grace and says immediately that we have to understand that salvation is something that we can only have if it is given to us by God. We can't get it. He has to give it. We first learn in verse 37 that a person cannot be saved from their sins without faith in Jesus. But how does a person come to have faith in Jesus? What does Jesus say here? Jesus says that the ones that come to him by faith have been given to him by the Father. In other words, God must first perform the act of giving the elected sinner to the Son. And all who are elected to come will come. First we notice in this verse the word all, as in the phrase, all that the Father hath given me. To whom must Jesus be referring to when he says, all that the Father hath given me? Obviously, all those who the Father gives to the Son refers to the elect as a mass unit. Once the Father has given them to the Son, what does Jesus say? Then they shall come to me. Father gives, Son says, then they shall come to me. It is only after God has performed the act of giving his electing grace that man has the ability to come to Christ. And that man will come to Christ because God's grace is irresistible. When Jesus says that the elect shall come, there is no equivocation here. It's as if there's still some possibility that they won't come. On the other hand, we're told that the Father's irresistible grace assures their coming to the point of absolute certainty. We know the elect will come, having been sent by the Father to the Son. And what does the Son declare? And him that cometh to me I cast not away. Verse 38. For I came down from heaven not to do my own will, but his will which has sent me. Now Jesus here explains why it is so certain that the Son will not cast out those given to him by the Father. It is because the will of the Father and the will of the Son is exactly the same. And it can only be exactly the same if Jesus is equal with God the Father. Jesus says this so the crowd may know that when they oppose the will of Jesus, they are also opposing the will of the Father, because they have the exact same will. In the final two verses here, Jesus defines the identical nature of the will of himself and the Father. Verse 39. And this is the Father's will which has sent me, that of all which he hath given me, I should lose nothing, but should raise it up again at the last day. Now Jesus combines his discussion of the will of the Father with divine predestination. Jesus restates that the will of the Father is to give his predetermined elect to the Son, that the work of the Son can save them. Jesus has previously told us that he will welcome all those elect whom the Father has given to him. Verse 38. Now Jesus goes one step further. He says, I should lose nothing. This is a clear example of the doctrine of perseverance. We notice that Jesus will personally secure the salvation of the elect, both by dying for the elect and as king and head of the church, bringing them to their reward by his personal protection and guidance. I will lose none, he says. The idea is that the counsel of God in calling his elect cannot be changed. It is decided. It is a calling that cannot be revoked and will definitely lead to spiritual life. When will the payment and work of Christ be applied? We're told in this verse, we're told at the last day, meaning the last day of the earth, when our bodies are raised in glory and reunited with our bodies in heaven for eternity. Jesus concludes, and this is the will of him that sent me, that every man which seeth the Son and believeth in him should have everlasting life, and I will raise him up at the last day. By now you'll notice Jesus has completely dropped the allegory, and he now summarizes by saying this, that if those in the crowd believe in God, and they desire to accept the eternal life that is being offered to them by God, then they must accept the means by which God is going to save his elect. That means that God has ordained